right, how's everybody doing tonight?
Good.
So how was Justin? I'm just kind of curious. How was Justin doing this before? Was he reading each chapter, and you would read it the time before? Or would he just go over each chapter specifically? Just the specific chapter. So everybody had read Acts 6. Did he go over Acts 6 last week? Okay. All right. Good. So I am on Acts 7. I just wanted to make sure before I got into that, because like Acts 7. Did anybody get a chance to read it? So did he give you like a heads up for what this week was going to be? Did he give you Acts 7? No?
Yeah,
Okay.
we're supposed to go through the whole book of Acts.
Supposed to go through the whole book. Okay, so he gave it through the whole book, and then we read it. Okay, does anybody remember anything from reading Acts 7? Just offhand, what's going on in Acts 7? Before I get into it too much. That's okay. It's a long... So basically...
Stephen, right?
What's that?
Stephen?
It is Stephen. It is Stephen. And it's a really long speech, is what's happening here, okay? So, I'll read some of the verses, but what I'll do is kind of break it down, because the whole chapter, he's talking about 3 different people. Actually, he's talking about 4 with Jesus, okay? So he comes in, and he's speaking directly to the establishment, the religious establishment, right? Everybody, I gotta move this. I'm a mover. I can't stand still. I've never been able to stand still in my life. So, we're going to be moving around. So he's talking to the religious establishment, okay? And they're really set in their ways, very respected. They've got the money, they've got the power. They're really good with Rome. They've got the good life right now, right? And here comes this upstart movement that's talking about this Messiah that they just crucified, and there was rumor he got resurrected, but they didn't see it, and all these people are following these people like Stephen, right? So he's really upsetting things, making everybody angry. Okay, so this is really uncomfortable for everybody who's in charge, because you got these new guys coming in trying to tell the establishment what's what, right? But he's not just telling them out of like a rebellious spirit, right? He's actually speaking directly to their history. He's talking directly to them as a people. He's talking about Abraham, he's talking about Joseph, and he's talking about Moses. And basically he's saying, and they're really hating this, but it is the truth, he's saying these people are like lead-ups and examples of what Jesus is the ultimate version of. So he's talking about Abraham, and he's talking about the covenant. So he starts out in 7, and he says, and he's speaking right to the high priest. So the high priest is like, he's like the governor, he's like the mayor, he's like the big shot, the big guy. He is the powerhouse, right? His word is spoken, it's done. That's how it works in this time frame, okay? So he's speaking directly to him. And you have to look at this. This was Judaism in that time. This was the truth. This was the Torah. This was the law. Right? This was the only truth from God they had at the time. And he said, Men, brethren, and fathers, listen to me. The God of glory appeared unto our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia, before he dwelt in Haran. And he said unto him, Get out of thy country and from thy kindred, and come into the land which I will show thee. And then he came out of the land of the Chaldeans and dwelt in Haran. And from there, when his father was dead, he removed him into his land. And where you're living now, that's what he's saying. And he gave him no inheritance in it, not so much as he set foot on it, but he gave him a promise that he would give it to him for a possession, and to his seed, all his kids after him, when as yet he had no child. And God spoke this to him, that his seed would live in a strange land, and they would bring them into bondage and entreat them into evil for hundreds of years. And the nation whom they built will be in bondage. He will judge it. But after that, he will bring them to this place. So what is he going on about? This is really a good history lesson, because this is what's going on in the Old Testament. He says to Abraham, get away from your family, get away from the old ways. I got a new life for you. That was a big step for Abraham, big covenant. Leave everything behind, and he was wealthy, by the way. His dad was very wealthy. Abraham came from a very wealthy family. Back then, if you were going to have wealth, it wasn't money, it was cattle, right? It was land, it was cattle, it was sheep, it was livestock, because that was their money, that was their stocks back then. That's where they had money. So he's like, God's like, get rid of it, leave it all, and come to this place that you've never seen, and trust me. That's pretty hard. Okay, that's a really hard spot to be in. Leave your family, leave where you came from, trust me, even though you can't see it. That's a lot of faith. that he's asking of Abraham, right? And he's talking to guys who really are just about the routine. He's talking to a high priest that doesn't have much faith. He's talking to a high priest that only cares about the outward appearance of looking like God, right? He's not actually having any heart change. Like Abraham had a heart to follow God. This is a big step, right? So he's talking about Abraham as a hero in this speech. And then he goes on about Joseph in verse 9. Now Joseph was four kids later, so he had Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then his son, one of his 12 sons, Joseph. And Joseph, everybody pretty familiar with the story of Joseph. He's the sort of the spoiled brat of the family, right? He's the young kid that the dad loves, and he gets all the attention, and he's a little cocky, okay? He's a little arrogant. And he says, he tells his brothers, you're going to fall down and worship me, and God's going to bless me, right? So his brothers hate this, fake his death, put him in slavery, right? Kid's been faithful to God. Now he's in slavery. And then he gets promoted out of slavery into a pretty good house in Egypt. He's doing stuff right. He's living pretty high life, even though he's a slave. It's a pretty good life. And then he has an opportunity to sin. What does he do? He doesn't sin. What does he get for that? Jail. It's not a fun deal. I don't like that. I don't like that at all. Would you? I wouldn't like that. I would have an attitude with God about that. If I'm really honest with myself, I probably would. I've done right, and I'm in jail. I'm supposed to trust you? My great-grandfather trusted you to leave his family to come to a land that I'm supposed to trust you? And God's like, yeah. But then God rewarded Joseph. He got him out of prison. He got him into the second only to Pharaoh. He was an executive. He was like the big shot in Egypt. He saved his family. God restored the situation with his family. And at the time, Egypt was like the top, that's the top, that's like the head of, it's like Washington, D.C. He's like number 2 only to the president, number 2 to the king. God fulfilled his promise and his word to Joseph. He fulfilled it to Abraham, he fulfilled it to Joseph, and then he fulfilled it to Moses, who's the third guy Stephen's talking about in this speech. There's a whole lot of history. We always focus on the martyrdom of Stephen, because at the end of it, he turns on the high priest and says they're basically doing this, and they're listening to him this whole time, but then they get, offended, and they kill him. That's the end of the chapter. But it's all the stuff that Stephen says that we don't focus on. It's the history behind what he's saying. He's leading up to the heroes of faith, and then he's giving the truth about Jesus, who is the fulfillment of God in the flesh. Abraham wasn't in the flesh. Abraham wasn't God in the flesh. Joseph wasn't God in the flesh. Moses wasn't God in the flesh, although they thought he was pretty close. Because he gave the law, right? Moses, what did he do? He was in Egypt. He was in a great place. He gets kicked out of it. What's that? He was a prince. He was like that. He was a prince. What does he do? He gets angry. He kills a guy. He has to go into hiding. He's in the back end of the wilderness for decades. Lives a whole other life. And then he was 80, by the way, when the burning bush happened. You're 80 years old, and you're just raising your sheep. You got kicked out of being a prince. Life is over. But then you go, and there's this glowing bush that doesn't stop. It doesn't burn up. It's glowing, and it's talking to you. And it says, you're standing on holy ground, take your shoes off, and I'm going to send you back. That's scary, right? It's a scary thing. Not only is the bush scary, it's also scary to think that I've got to go back and face this. Not only do I have to go back to my past, I've got to go back to the place where I was really doing well. I was a prince. And now I barely am I'm farming sheep. And I have a stutter. He stuttered too. He couldn't talk. He had to have his brother speak for him. He was too afraid. Stephen's talking about the heroes of faith. He's talking about Abraham. He's talking about Joseph, he's talking about Moses, and all three of them had promises from the Lord, and all three of them got it fulfilled. They chose. They chose to believe, and God rewarded them for that choice. They were not special people. They weren't. Abraham was a liar. He lied to save his wife. I would have probably done the same, but he was still a liar. Joseph was arrogant. And Moses, he had a rage problem. He killed a guy. And it got him in trouble later with God, too. The point is, these people were not perfect, but they had one thing in common, and that was belief that God says it, he will do it. And that's why he's building them up to saying, Jesus is the fulfillment of all of this. And there's so much more history that Stephen didn't go into. He barely got even into David. And he's laying out a case, because it was like their court with the high priest. So he's laying out the case to them and saying, look, this is the promised Messiah. He's already come, and you rejected him. Now, they don't like that, because first of all, they don't have any concept that the Messiah would first come suffering. They didn't like those scriptures, because that was a promise too. Just like a promise to Abraham, just like a promise to Joseph, and just like a promise to Moses, that he would do what he did in the promised land, do what he did in the wilderness, do what he did with Pharaoh, just as he fulfilled it for Moses. There is a promise about a suffering Messiah. That's an uncomfortable promise. We like to focus on the ones that haven't yet been fulfilled, but they will be. That was what they like to focus on too, because they were under, at the time Stephen's talking, they were under a lot of oppression. They were under Rome. That's not a happy place to be. You're practically in slavery. And they wanted a political deliverer, and they weren't getting that. They were getting this young upstart with his small band of followers doing miracles and causing trouble. And they didn't like that. But those who saw the truth of it followed Jesus and understood that. And the disciples did that. Stephen understood that. But what he's leading up to in that story is so important, and we miss it all, because he's taking everything that's on the foundation of the Old Testament, which is the foundation of the New. We cannot have the New without the Old. We can't have the truth of Jesus and the salvation that he brings us without the understanding of everything in the past. That's so important, and we sometimes forget that. It gets lost in translation. And the book of Hebrews, by the way, is totally about this. It's great because it goes into more depth. It goes into each story. It goes into Moses and Sinai and saying we're being called higher than Moses was. And he was on Sinai and he was glowing when he came down. But God wants us to have something deeper. And I think that sometimes, I always like to take a different angle on a passage, because I think we tend to, we have one passage and usually the message is primarily the same from the passage. And yes, the passage is on the front about Stephen's martyrdom. But we don't go into the actual speech he gives. It's all about heroes of the faith, but only heroes because they believed in the promise and acted in obedience to do it. They were first they were high, they were brought low, and they were brought back up again. And he took them through that process. There was the good times, it got really bad, and then it got better. And the great thing is, Jesus is going to have the same situation in the second coming. When he comes back, first of all, he's going to come back in a time where the only thing that can fix the earth is him. And sorry, we're not there yet. But we will be. And that promise will be fulfilled too. He was resurrected. He came as a suffering Messiah. He did all the miracles that they said. He fulfilled every one of the prophecies that he had to at the time that he came. But it's going to be a big show yet to come. And that is still the fulfillment, as he promised Abraham about the land and his children. He gave it to him. As he promised Joseph about his position, he gave it to him. And they both lived to see it, of their own promise. Moses, same thing. He got to see a lot. He didn't get to see the promised land, but he got all the blessings that he needed to. So I think that's what we take away from Stephen's speech, is that we're always like, well, he was the first martyr. And yes, we admire that. But beyond that, read the history lesson he's given you. Because it really enriches the truth of what Jesus is really about. He is your salvation, but there's so much more history in the build-up to who he is. I really like Acts 7 for that reason, because in a really short period of time, Stephen delivers one of the best speeches he could have for the Old Testament. And trying to reach them, which is really kind of interesting. He's trying to reach these guys. Because they know their history. They know who Moses is. They know who Joseph is and Abraham. And they honor them. And they see them as only second to God. And he's saying, I'm counting each one of them. And then he's saying, you've rejected them. You've rejected Jesus. You might as well have rejected them. And that's, I think, the biggest takeaway. He's still trying to evangelize them. He's still trying to give them a choice in their hardness of heart. He's still trying to lay out the case that what you believe hadn't been fulfilled yet. The promise was fulfilled, and it will be fulfilled again. That's hard for us who lives 70 to 80 years, if we're lucky, and we don't usually get to see the fulfillment of a lot of the promises, maybe even in our own lives. That's hard for us because we live on this time frame where just straight, just life, that's it. God's outside time. He's past, present, and future. He knows the end from the beginning. And that's really hard for us where we're impatient and we're like, God, you promised something and 40 years goes by and nothing happens.
There's some that's happening in our time.
I know, and then there's some, and yes, and then like for Joseph and Abraham, and then all of a sudden it happens. Abraham was in his 90s when he had Isaac, right? And then you've got Joseph. Now, he was younger. He had a really rough time, though. I will say, those 13 years were really bad. But then he got really good, and he was in his 30s. So he got to see it. And Moses got to see most of it. He lived to be about 120. Didn't get into the promised land, but that's another story. But he still got through so much and saw so much fulfilled. And that goes for a lot of people. So hang on to your promises. Because God does that. He fulfills His covenant. He is a covenant God. He puts His own word above His own name. That's a big deal to Him. If He promises something, He will fulfill it. And that's really the measure of faith. It's not that He can. We know He's God. Okay, yeah, He can. But will He? He will. Amen. So look for His promises. And just like these heroes of faith believed on it, believe it for your own life. And that's the great takeaway from Acts 7. That you can absolutely know your promises will be fulfilled if you hold to Him in obedience and love to Him. Because that's the motive. That's the heart motive these guys had. Abraham, Joseph, Moses. They had motive that wanted to obey because they loved Him. They didn't even really know what they were getting. Abraham, he just told them, hey, go to that land. I don't even know what that land is. But go to that land. Okay. And he did it. That's pretty stunning if you think about it. God told you one day to wake up and say, take your family and your people and, go someplace. Would you do that? I don't know. That's a tough question, right? Right. So.
And it's like there's the sea in between and you've got death behind you, Pharaoh and everything.
Yeah, you got that too. That's not funny though.
It's really hard.
It is really hard. and you're not like a spring chicken anymore. I mean, you're like over 80 and like I really don't feel like running through the desert with that's not what I do feel like doing either. But there's a lot of hope in this chapter, even though it's a really depressing and sad chapter that we don't like to focus on the end. But there's a lot of hope in the stories that he delivers because it always goes to show we have our wilderness time. And I put my quote wilderness in quotes. So there's 40 years in the back end of the desert before the promised land. And maybe it's yours is 40, maybe yours is 4. Hey, that'd be great. Israel could have done it in 11 days, that journey, but because of their stubbornness and their sin and their inability to just believe God and do as they said, most of them died in the wilderness. And it was 2 from the originals that made it through. So that's a lesson. I got to remind myself all the time too. How easy is it for us to get frustrated, even though we see so many things of God in our life, even though we see so many ways that He touches our lives, just like the Israelites did. They saw the pillar of smoke during the day, the pillar of fire by night, the rock that gave them water, the quail, everything. But still, you brought us out here to die. And that was their heart, and God doesn't want that heart, and it's so easy for us to fall into that. So. Anyway, heroes of faith, promises fulfilled, you can make it through the wilderness, and on the other side of it, God will fulfill His promise, even if it takes a long, long time. So, that's my takeaway from Acts 7. I hope that maybe we can go back and read over the speech that he gives and the heroes that he outlines, because it's really worth time to study. And it's also worth time to go back to the old scriptures that he's talking about. Because there's so much history in the Old Testament, and it's not in a little nutshell like we see here.